That night, the blizzard carried no sound of wind or falling snow. It carried the sound of abrasion, as if a gigantic metallic jaw were slowly grinding away at the external texture of the world. Silas set the half-empty glass of amber liquor onto the cold slate tabletop. The flickering lamplight washed over his face, revealing lines etched not by age but by the friction of stacked realities. His eyes, a dead, non-reflective ash gray, looked right through the listener, as though analyzing an infinite and painful mathematical formula. "The outside reality is thinning," Silas stated. His voice was devoid of emotion, measured and chillingly steady, like a clock buried deep underground. "I am not speaking of the weather. I am speaking of the barrier. Do you hear that tearing sound? That is the limit of Euclidean space being stretched to the point of near rupture. When it gives way, this structure, the ossuary, is the only thing standing between you and the cold void no sane mind should ever try to visualize." The ossuary. It was not a building by human definition. It was an architectural ulcer, a geometric anomaly that was pushed into, or more accurately, summoned at a point cartographers referred to as the blind spot of creation. Silas called it the celestial wound. "This location," he continued, gesturing with a thin, bony finger into the air, "is a forgotten point. When the universe was written, there was a typographical error, a void the Creator overlooked, and that void was rapidly filled by things that should not have shape. The ossuary is a wedge. It is not a structure built. It is a blocking agent formed of pain and impossible logic to cap that wound." Silas dismissed the notion that he was a host, a warden, or even a simple caretaker. "I am the keeper of the old covenants. Nothing more, nothing less. My job is not to serve guests, but to ensure the temporary physical laws of this place are honored. If one of the covenants is broken, it will not result in an accident. It will result in the collapse of the entire structure into the emptiness it is trying to cover." He spoke of horrific tragedies with the detachment of a man reading a stock ledger. To Silas, the deaths, the disappearances, and the gruesome transformations were merely evidence of the precision of the laws he was guarding. Understand this. The ossuary is an entity that demands adherence. It possesses no conscience, only structural logic, and it needs matter to sustain itself. He glanced towards the dark, rough walls, where the stone blocks seemed to intersect without adhering to any common architectural rule. "Why is it called the ossuary? Because it is a storage house, not of spare building materials, but of the residual matter of the casualties. Those who failed to adhere become the raw material needed to maintain the shape of this place. Cartilage, bone, flesh, memories, all are pulverized and recycled, homogenized into the mortar and the impossible angles." Silas slightly pushed back his sleeve, revealing a disturbing tattoo on his forearm. It was a geometric symbol that seemed to subtly shift its configuration if looked at too long. Even the basic maintenance is not conducted by men. Who funded this absurdity? An organization that history tried, and failed, to forget, the Etheric Trust. Though they were supposedly purged and destroyed by the Inquisition in the 16th century, funds, rare materials, and structural directives continue to arrive mysteriously. No one knows who, or what, runs them, but they know this wedge must be held fast. He rose, his shadow stretching in long, warped lines across the floor. For years, they tried everything to destroy the ossuary, to permanently seal the celestial wound. They used explosives, holy fire, even forgotten physical theorems. All failed. When you try to destroy something that was born of a gap, you only make the gap wider. Silas approached an old, rickety shelf piled with leather-bound volumes secured with iron wire. None of the titles were legible. Each night here is a different calculation. Tonight, the storm is pulling something closer. The fog is not just moisture. It is a visual corrosion of reality. Thus, I must tell you of the old covenants. They are not rituals. They are physical obligations. Failure to adhere will not kill you. It will synthesize you. He turned back, his gray eyes contracting slightly in the lamplight. Most previous guests thought they were dealing with cheap ghost stories. They laughed. They took photographs. They extinguished the fire on a dare. The result of that disrespect was 6 fossilized cartilage finger-knuckle rings found in the ash box, or a visiting professor of research found molded into a load-bearing wall, his face intact, but his body a part of the masonry. I do not tell these tales for entertainment. I tell them so you understand. These things are happening right now, and we are inside them. Silas paused, the tearing sound outside the ossuary having intensified to a continuous, high-pitched screech of grinding metal. He needed to move to the core of survival. Before I speak of the rules, he said, we must understand the origin of this structure. It explains why adherence is paramount. It explains why everything here is governed by geometry. Silas began by describing the utter impossibility of locating the ossuary. If you attempt to use any modern navigation equipment, satellites will only register white static noise, an unpenetrated zone of interference. It sits at a blind spot of space and time. This is not accidental. It is the result of a sacrifice and a design. He referenced the tragedy of architect Elias Thorne, 1902. Thorne was no common architect. He was an esoteric geometer, commissioned by the Etheric Trust to anchor the ossuary into physical reality. Thorne led an expedition, equipped with unconventional astronomical measuring tools and compasses, to locate the epicenter of the celestial wound. They vanished for 3 months. When the rescue team finally found him, Thorne was the only survivor, but not in an intact state. Silas stared at his own palm, as if reading lines etched there. Thorne was paralyzed, unable to speak, but his body was covered in incisions carved into the flesh, from scalp to heel. They were not random wounds. They were complex geometric diagrams, etched deep into his dermis. Every angle, every non-Euclidean curve, every physical and non-physical measurement of the ossuary was encoded upon his body. Thorne died shortly after in a delirious state, constantly begging geometry to release him. The horrific part was that the mad mathematicians of the Trust copied those incisions. They were the perfect, detailed blueprints of the ossuary. In fact, Silas stressed, the incisions on Thorne's body included future structural errors, points of weakness that we must patch with the old covenants. Thorne did not build the ossuary. He became the living blueprint, tortured and transformed by the mathematical rules of this place. This is why the ossuary cannot be destroyed. It was not constructed of common material, but was summoned from a dark geometric concept. It is an entity created from the crystallization of alien mathematical rules. The money and maintenance materials continue to be paid by Etheric Trust, EST, unknown. We receive directives via ancient parchment scrolls, delivered in boxes bearing no postal stamp and no trace. The Trust knows that one slight structural failure will plunge the entire area into non-temporal void space, and everything within it, including you and me, will become building material for another dimension. Silas shifted to describing the 3 core rules, the mandatory covenants that guests must adhere to prevent the cold outside from leaching into the structure. These are not rumors or superstitions to frighten children. These are the temporary physical laws the ossuary is forced to obey. If you break them, you are voluntarily relinquishing the physical barrier between yourself and the things waiting outside the walls. #######1. The refusal of reflection. Any attempt to record the image of the ossuary fails. This includes photographs, video recordings, sketches, or even attempting to accurately recall the architectural details. The structure refuses replication. It is a self-preserving measure to prevent the exterior geometry from using its likeness to create a vulnerability. Silas explained that any photograph taken inside the ossuary either turns completely black or displays an image of another space, an endlessly twisting corridor, or a snow field devoid of footprints. Only one photograph was successfully taken in 1972, before the Trust scientists realized the risk. The photo showed a woman, referred to as the target, standing by the hearth. Across the image, a sharp, cold, physical crack ran across her head like a crude stitch. Hours later, She used a needle to stitch her own head along the exact line of the crack in the photo. She believed she was patching her reality. Never carry a camera. #####2. The cinder dust barrier. Before the first night ends, you must sprinkle a ring of calcified cinder dust around your sleeping quarters. This is a physical barrier. This ash is not common wood ash. It is the residue of matter incinerated in the ossuary's history, fossilized bone, burnt cartilage, and fragments of unidentifiable metals. It works against the crawling entity. This creature is not a ghost. It is a geometric entity, existing in non-physical angles. It cannot cross a barrier made of matter that the ossuary has absorbed and purged. As you sleep, the crawling entity will examine every corner of the room, looking for a pathway in. It does not try to harm you violently. It will exchange your body with inert materials currently holding the structure steady. #####3. The heart of stone, perpetual fire. The fire in the main hearth must burn continuously, never allowed to extinguish from the moment the fog descends, dusk, until the fog lifts, dawn. This is the most critical covenant. Silas emphasized, the fire is not merely a source of heat. It is the reality heartbeat of the ossuary. Its thermal energy is what maintains the cohesion between the matter within and the void outside. If it goes out, even for 1 minute, the structure wobbles, and the gap we are blocking begins to claim what it is missing. Silas did not need to explain the consequences. He merely needed to describe history. The perpetual fire has been extinguished twice in my records. Both times resulted in architectural, not personal, disaster. #####Instance 1. The recycling of matter. In 1947, a newly hired groundsman was negligent. The fire went out for 90 minutes. The next morning, no human remains were found, but in the cold ash box, we located 6 dense, gray objects, 6 rings of fossilized human cartilage finger knuckles. Their size and density indicated they were compressed with unthinkable force. This proved that when the ossuary loses its reality heartbeat, it synthesizes the necessary material for recovery from the things it has already absorbed. Those 6 rings were the recycled remnants of individuals who had vanished since the 19th century. ####Instance 2. The fusion. The second time was the most terrifying, in 1988. A drunken guest, a physicist who ridiculed the covenants, deliberately poured liquor into the hearth. The fire died for 3 hours. We did not find him in his sleeping quarters. Silas stood tall and pointed towards the rough, gray stone wall at the end of the hall, where a strange, bumpy protrusion existed. The next morning, the guest was found molded deep within the main load-bearing wall behind the hall. His entire body was stretched and compressed to the point of being unrecognizable by our laws of physics. Limbs were impossibly elongated, bones flattened into thin sheets. But the face remained perfectly preserved in horror, trapped beneath the rough stone. He was not killed. He had become a part of the structure and the sorrow, forever supporting the impossible angles of the ossuary with his own matter. That is how it patches itself. Silas began walking, leading the guest down a narrow passage. Along the hallway were heavy oak doors, sealed with black wax and severe geometric sigils. "These are the sealed chambers," Silas murmured, his voice carrying cold reverence. "Each room is a failed experiment, a testament to why the covenants must be honored. They store the matter and energy of terrible mistakes." #####Room 7, the bridal suite. This couple was on their honeymoon in 1961. They ignored the cinder covenant. The groom was found the next morning in a state of panic, tearing off his own fingernails and chewing through all his finger joints. He had seen something crawl in his dreams. The bride? She was found in the bathroom. She was hanging by her severed Achilles tendons, and the most horrifying detail, her eyelids were sewn open with thin copper wire to force her to stare directly into the bathroom mirror. The mirror contained no reflection of her. The groom survived, but afterward, he constantly maintained that his bride had been replaced with matter, a soulless duplicate formed of what the ossuary had stolen. Hashtag room 32, the Ascender. This is where an esoteric researcher named Dr. Armitage disappeared in 1999. She attempted to find ascension using Thorne's geometric theorems. She failed in an unforgivable manner. Silas described the gruesome scene. Armitage was found in the sauna room, having carved a clean, precise line from her jaw to her abdomen. She did it with impossible surgical precision. Her entire spinal column had been removed. And then, she had arranged it in the torn mattress to form an ascending stairway. Each vertebra was carefully placed as a tiny step, leading straight up the ceiling, towards a blind spot in the space where two angles never met. Silas turned back, his liquor glass now empty. The blizzard outside had reached its peak, and the metallic scraping was a continuous, shrill shriek. He stared hard at the guest. These laws are tonight's survival obligations. You have heard the history. You have seen the proof in the walls. The final warning was delivered like an urgent prayer, yet remained cold and unforgiving. Dusk is approaching. Before the shadows fall, you must ensure the cinder dust is scattered fully around your bed. You must light the fire and ensure it rages until dawn. For tonight, the ossuary is hungry, and the cold outside is very close. My role here is not that of a concierge, nor a glorified bellhop. I am Silas, the caretaker. This structure, which some misguidedly call a hotel, is the ossuary. It is not a place of rest, but a block of anomalous architecture constructed not on land, but directly over a superior wound, a searing tear in the fundamental fabric of things. My function is not to serve. It is to ensure strict adherence to the old covenants, the unbreakable geometric codes that prevent reality itself from folding in upon us. Silas offered a smile that held no warmth, merely a thin, dry rupture across old canvas. His ash-gray eyes flicked toward the window pane, where the first flakes of snow were beginning to defy gravity, spiraling upward into the twilight sky. You inquire about the ossuary's location, he began, his voice dropping to the abrasive rasp of grinding granite. Location cannot be determined by conventional coordinates. It is not a place. It is a typographical error in the text of reality. He explained that should any human satellite or GPS attempt to locate this structure, they would record only a static void, a field of pure white noise that devours all radio waves and signals. On older maps, the area was sometimes marked ignis fatuus, ghost fire. Yet to those initiated into the truth, it is where matter grows weary and exhausted from the strain of infinity. We sit upon the superior wound. It is not a tear that might heal. It is a blind spot, a failure of Euclidean space to contain what it was never meant to define. To conceal that void required a material capable of existing both within and outside of logic. Silas paused, taking a slow sip of something dark and potent from his glass, and then recounted the terrible origins of the structure. In 1902, under the guise of a geological survey, architect Elias Thorne led an expedition into what was then known as the Great Northern Waste. His public mission was the discovery of rare ore. His true purpose was to find the purchase point between our world and the cold outside. He was a rigid rationalist, a man who believed everything could be described by ratio and measure. Pity the man for his certainty. After 6 weeks missing, only Thorne was found. He suffered no injury from exposure or animal attack. He was discovered curled beneath a fir tree, completely paralyzed from the neck down. The first thing the rescue team noted was his eyes. They were distended, almost protruding from their sockets, reflecting sheer, utter cosmic terror, but completely dry. The true horror lay in Thorne's physical form. The entire surface of his flesh, from the knees to the crown of his skull, had been incised with lines of ridiculous precision. These were not crude gashes. They were hair-thin striations, executed with absolute sharpness and unwavering stability. They did not bleed, looking instead like surgical tattoos etched deep into the muscle tissue. Thorne was returned to the city. He survived for 3 more days in a clinic, unable to speak, unable to move, yet he constantly emitted a high-pitched, thin whine, like the screech of an old compass attempting to draw an infinite circle. Geometric and medical scholars were brought in to study the body. They realized with growing dread that the incisions were not abstract patterns. They were the perfect, detailed blueprints for the ossuary. Every corner, every load-bearing column, every minute drainage channel, all were encoded within Thorne's tissues. Silas shrugged, as if discussing a minor construction fault. They included every specification, including the structural defects, the deliberate errors. For instance, we have a corridor on the second floor where the wall must appear plumb according to human rules, but according to the geometry of the superior wound, it must be angled 4.5 degrees inward to maintain stability. Thorne's striations detailed this. They were not architectural designs. They were the stress maps of reality. Thorne died when his face contorted into one final, impossible shape, an anatomical diagram of despair. But the blueprints were complete. The ossuary was not built, Silas asserted, emphasizing the word. One cannot construct this using brick, mortar, or steel. Conventional materials disintegrate instantly when exposed to the spatial pressures here. The ossuary was summoned, called forth from dark geometric concepts, using the pain and dissolution of a single human mind as its catalyst. He explained that the structure demands constant material maintenance. If a single wall shifts even slightly from its countergeometric requirement, the entire structure will be swallowed by the void it conceals. This is why the upkeep of this place is so horrific and persistent. So who pays for this material-bending edifice? Silas asked, answering his own question immediately. A fair inquiry, as I am paid in coins dating back to the 18th century, minted from an alloy containing no element found on Mendeleev's table. The funding comes from a secretive organization, Etheric Trust, EST, unknown. This trust was supposedly scrubbed from human history around the late 16th century, hunted by the European Inquisitions for the crime of angle worship. They believed that God was not a being, but a shape, and that the only salvation lay in restructuring one's own geometries. Though the organization was destroyed, the money never stopped flowing. Monthly, ancient sacks of coinage appear on the ossuary's threshold, always accompanied by a detailed manifest of required materials. Limestone processed with human ash, plaster mixed with crushed bone, and tons of unidentifiable fuel to feed the eternal fire covenant. The frightening thing is not that they still exist, Silas hissed deep in his throat. The frightening thing is that this financial obligation exists. It proves that the universe holds a debt to the thing the ossuary restrains. And that debt must be paid. Otherwise, the collector comes here, not for money, but for matter. He set his glass down heavily, the dry clack echoing in the vast hall. Now, we shall discuss how to keep your matter from becoming auxiliary building material. The three binding covenants. First, the refusal of reflection. Silas fixed his gaze upon the listener. The ossuary exists in a state of negation. If you attempt to capture its image, via camera, video, or even a detailed sketch, you are attempting to pull it into the logic of the external world, and it will resist. How? By erasing itself. Any photograph taken within the ossuary results either in a complete black plate or a scene utterly unrelated to the hotel, usually a burned forest or a frozen ocean. These images are the false memories the ossuary inserts to deceive human technology. There is only one surviving photograph from 1972, taken by a ghost hunter who ignored the warnings. It was a picture of an empty room. It showed a young woman, the subject, standing in the center. But look closely, Silas instructed. She is not entirely there. The picture shows a physical seam, like a coarse stitch of black thread, running across the woman's forehead, splitting her skull. That seam was not a lens error. It was the reality rupture where she stood. She vanished that night, but the photograph remains, a warning that the ossuary accepts documentation, but only if the recorder agrees to become a temporary vessel for the rupture itself. The second and most vital covenant for your survival tonight is the cinder dust. Silas indicated an earthenware jar filled with heavy, almost metallic gray powder. Before the first night ends, you must cast a continuous ring of this calcified ash around your bed. The circle must not break. This dust is the residue of millennia of matter consumed by the ossuary, bone, petrified wood, and the remnants of those humans dissolved in the hearth. It possesses no magical quality. It has the physical properties of the ossuary itself. The ash creates a physical barrier, a surface the dark geometry cannot adhere to. It resists the crawling entity. The crawling entity is not a ghost or a demon. It is a spatial distortion, a creature that exists only in non-physical angles. It travels through spaces where matter cannot, through the gap between two walls, through the pooling shadow beneath a wardrobe. Its purpose is to convert the sharp angles in your room, e.g., the 90-degree corner of the wall, into impossible angles, e.g., 108.2 degrees, the angle at which reality snaps. If the circle of ash is broken, the entity will penetrate. It does not need to touch you. It only needs to rearrange you according to its laws. This usually results in you being folded into irrecoverable polyhedral shapes. Finally, the heart of stone. Silas pointed to the main hearth, where a tremendous fire burned with a fierce, overly hot intensity, yet without the usual smell of smoke. This fire is the heartbeat of this place. It must burn constantly. It must not fail from dusk, when the fog rolls in, until dawn, when the fog retreats. The fire, Silas explained, maintains the temperature and vibrational frequency the ossuary requires for its physical coherence. When the fire blazes, it creates a thin membrane of human reality around the superior wound. If it goes out, the cold outside rushes in. The ingress is not a flood of water or a gust of wind. It is an intrusion of other geometry. To break the fire covenant is not merely an act of foolishness. It is an act of geometric suicide. Silas did not need to explain the penalties. He simply recounted the consequences, his voice flat and unwavering, as if listing the ingredients for a recipe. The fire has been extinguished twice in my recorded history, not counting the intentional tests by the trust. Those times we simply sealed the room quickly and forgot about it. The first time was an accident. A guest neglected to shovel the mandated fuel, a special, highly pressure-compressed coal, into the hearth at roughly 3 a.m. The fire died for 90 minutes. 90 minutes was enough for the cold outside to make its contribution. The following morning, we found no great architectural changes. But when we cleaned the hearth, we discovered foreign objects in the ash box. Silas described 6 objects, solid, gray, and impossibly heavy for their size. They were 6 fossilized human cartilage finger rings. Guests to the ossuary are never permitted to wear rings, jewelry, or precious metals. That is a subsidiary rule. What the ossuary consumed was not the fingers themselves, but the cartilage joints that held the history and memory of those who were currently present. In those 90 minutes, it automatically transmuted the soft, flexible cartilage matter into a mineral harder than steel. It proves that the ossuary does not just consume, it repurposes matter out of the pain of its predecessors. The second instance was the intentional act of an esoteric scientist, driven by challenge and whiskey. He believed the covenants were a ruse to keep staff, like Silas, employed. At approximately 1 a.m., he doused the flame with a bucket of ice water. We knew instantly, Silas said. A cold hiss, and then the silence. Silence in the ossuary is not the absence of sound. It is the absence of life frequencies. When the light returned, the man was gone. But Silas pointed to a massive, load-bearing wall behind the lobby. He is there. The drunken guest was not murdered and then hidden. He was cast directly into the main load-bearing wall. His entire body was stretched and compressed to physical impossibility. His height was elongated by 3 feet, and his body was flattened, like an abstract sculpture rendered in distorted flesh. Yet his face remained intact, pulled long, with wide, protruding eyes and the horror forever locked within. He was not killed. He became part of the structure and the suffering, an organic building material. The impossible angles of the ossuary need constant support, and he provided it. When reality ruptures, whatever is nearest is used to repair it. and he forever supports that 108.2-degree angle. Silas returned to his glass, the air now heavy with the weight of the unimaginable. He described the room sealed with lead and concrete, the vaults holding the most catastrophic failures in the ossuary's history. Room 7, the bridal suite, he recounted. It was where a newly married couple, brought here as a cruel joke by a friend, had ignored the cinder covenant. When we opened the door, Silas narrated, the groom was sitting on the bed, completely still. He had meticulously pulled off all his fingernails and chewed clean through every finger joint. That action was an unconscious attempt to rid himself of the smallest containers the dark geometry could infiltrate. The bride was found in the bathroom. She was suspended by her Achilles tendons, which had been cleanly severed and tied to a ceiling hook. The worst detail was her eyes. She had been stitched shut with fine copper wire, forcing her to stare into the vanity mirror above the sink. The mirror was empty. They believed the bride had been replaced by matter. The crawling entity invaded and assumed her space. Since she was no longer her, she cast no reflection. The groom destroyed himself to avoid replacement. The bride was forced to stare into the void she had become. Room 32, the Ascender. This was the room of an esoteric researcher who attempted to harmonize with the ossuary's geometry. She believed she could use the superior wound to achieve apotheosis. She got halfway, Silas conceded. The woman was found in the steam room, where she had made a single, precise incision running from jaw to abdomen. Forensic doctors could never explain the instrument used. The horror was that her entire spine had been removed with impossible surgical skill, one vertebra at a time, without tearing the surrounding tissue. The spine was not discarded. It was meticulously arranged on the torn mattress into an ascending stairway. Each vertebra was placed carefully like a small step, stacked one upon the other, leading directly up to the ceiling, aiming for a blind spot in the space where she believed her transcendence would begin. She left this place, Silas stated dryly. But she left her bridge, and the etheric trust believes she succeeded in escaping the grip of matter, though we still had to seal room 32 due to the stench of geometric failure. Silas concluded his accounting, the blizzard outside now sounding like the furious metallic scraping against the stone walls. He stared hard at the guest. You have heard what is required. These are laws, not threats. They are the obligation of survival for this night. He lifted the jar of calcified cinder dust, placing it heavily beside the guest, a weighted, ritualistic act. His final warning was spoken, quiet but absolute, cutting through the sound of the storm. Before the dark settles, you must ensure the cinder dust is cast. For tonight, the ossuary is hungry, and the dark geometry seeks new material to fortify its structure. Silas shoved the glass of strong liquor across the table toward me, the cold clink of the ice almost swallowed by the odd silence of the ossuary. Outside, the air was utterly still, yet I could feel an invisible pressure pressing down on my eardrums. Silas's ash-gray eyes, looking like millennia-old cooled embers, did not look at me. They looked through me, through the stone wall, and perhaps through reality itself. Do not mistake me for a housekeeper, or even a simple custodian, he began in a steady, dry tone, devoid of emotion save for an eternal weariness. I am the keeper of the old covenants, rules meant not to protect your comfort, but to protect the very fabric of this place. And tonight, can you feel it? The reality outside is thinning. It is no longer a solid wall. It is a tattered, thin sheet. The ossuary was not a building in the conventional sense. It was a bizarre construct, a structure of metal and limestone stretched to the limits of logic, erected upon a site Silas called the supernal scar. This scar is a place where space and time no longer communicate according to normal laws. We are not here. We are cloaking this place. Silas began listing gruesome tragedies with the nonchalance of one reciting mathematical theorems, emphasizing that suffering and the dissolution of matter are fundamental elements in maintaining the structure. This place demands adherence. It is not merely a repository for the material remains of victims. It is their physical relic. It operates under the mandate of something called the Heresy Trust, a name that was scrubbed from historical texts long before Copernicus charted his first diagram. He took a sip of his drink. Remember this. Your presence here is not a privilege. It is an obligation. And tonight, we must ensure the ossuary does not swallow us whole before dawn. Silas explained that the ossuary's location sits at a blind spot in space and time. Any modern locator device, if allowed to operate nearby, would register only white static noise, a pure interference that neurophysicists once dubbed the silence of God. He revealed the impossible origin of the building's architecture, the tragedy of architect Elias Thorne, 1902. Thorne had led an expedition team seeking a site for construction. They vanished for 4 weeks. When Thorne was found, he was the sole survivor, but completely paralyzed, lying on a cold slab of rock. Thorne was not merely injured. His body had been written upon, Silas said, his voice sharpening for the first time. His entire frame, from neck to ankle, was covered in incisions etched deep into the flesh, forming complex, incomprehensible geometric charts, multidimensional shapes the eye cannot process. Those charts were not language. They were mathematical formulae stretched into agony. Thorne died in a delirium 3 days later, constantly pleading with geometry to release him. The terrifying realization came when scientists and architects analyzed the incisions. They were the perfect, detailed blueprints for the ossuary. Not just floor plans or cross-sections, but the precise fault lines, the structural failures that would appear years later, and the exact placement of every limestone block. That means the ossuary was not built conventionally, Silas murmured. It wasn't constructed with brick and mortar. It was summoned. It was pulled in from a concept of dark geometry, from a dimension where physical laws are warped by sheer will. He flipped open a brittle, mold-eaten leather folder displaying a scrawled inscription, "Maintenance paid by Etheric Trust, EST, unknown." Silas sighed. An organization supposedly routed and destroyed completely by the Inquisition in the 16th century. Yet the rent still arrives, as regular as a dead heart's beat. Silas set the folder down and nudged the liquor glass my way again, signaling the end of history and the beginning of immediate law. His voice turned stern, every word weighed as if it were a stabilizing stone placed upon a trembling structure. "Now for the rules," Silas said. "These are not superstitions. These are the physical laws of the ossuary, written in the experience of hundreds of souls who made mistakes. You must abide by these 3 core covenants to prevent the outside cold from seeping in and reshaping you to its will. The refusal of reflection. The first covenant is absolute. You must not attempt to capture the image of the ossuary by any means, be it photograph, video, or even detailed sketch," Silas declared. He explained that the ossuary resists being contained within any 2-dimensional frame. Its non-Euclidean nature opposes linear interpretation. When one tries to photograph it, they are attempting to force the multidimensional structure into a flat frame, and the act generates intense resistance. Electronics will glitch. Photos turn pure black, not from lack of light, but from the absorption of every photon that hits the lens. Sometimes, worse, they display the image of another space, a spiraling corridor with no end, or a corner filled with molding that does not exist in your physical view. Silas produced an ancient, corner-scorched photograph, sealed in protective glass. It was the only remaining evidence of a photo successfully, or nearly successfully, taken in 1972. It showed a woman, whom the old records referred to as the target. This was taken before her matter was stretched and made part of the permanent structure. "Look closely." I looked. The woman stood in the main hall, staring directly at the lens. She wasn't smiling. Her face bore an expression somewhere between shock and acceptance. The terrifying thing was not her gaze, but a physical fracture, seemingly not on the photograph, but on her very reality, running straight across her head. "That is a fissure," Silas confirmed, his voice cold as steel. "A surgical line running from one temple to the other, like a crude stitch. That is where her reality was forced to communicate with the ossuary's geometry. She was successfully framed, but the price was the disintegration of personal perception. That fissure is the point where the room's non-material shape began to replace her biological matter. Never try to record this place. If you succeed, you will make yourself architectural matter. 2. The cinder dust. The second covenant involves physical protection and must be completed before the first night is over, Silas continued. You must sprinkle a complete circle of cinder dust around your sleeping area. The circle must be continuous, without any breaks. Silas explained the true nature of the dust. It wasn't simple firewood ash. These are the relics of matter incinerated during the Ossuary's history. It is the calcified bone and charred cartilage of those who failed to adhere. It holds enough density of memory and material resistance to temporarily define a separate space. The dust acts as a physical barrier, but against the non-physical. In the night, as the outside cold begins to leak, non-corporeal entities are permitted to move. We call one of them the crawling entity. It does not walk. It travels by jumping across angles that do not exist in three-dimensional geometry. Silas pointed toward the corner of the room, where two walls and the floor met in a perfect line. It exists in those 90-degree corners, in the physical junctions you deem harmless. Cinder dust is a kind of metaphysical viscous fluid. When laid in a perfect circle, it creates a perceptual boundary. It tells the geometry that inside this circle, only your matter is permitted to exist. It forces the crawling entity to travel along defined Euclidean straight lines rather than its impossible angles, making it unable to penetrate. If the circle is broken, or if you forget to lay it, even if you do not see the crawling entity, it will begin to apply its geometry to your body while you sleep. Silas shivered subtly, a rare action that chilled me. The stories of waking up with reversed joints or stretched tendons are not folklore. Do this before the sun is completely set. 3. The heart of stone. The third covenant is the most critical to our collective survival. The fire in the main hearth must burn continuously, Silas emphasized, pointing to the immense, flickering stone fireplace at the end of the hall. The fire is not merely a source of heat. It is a reality stabilizer for the ossuary. This fire is the ossuary's existential heartbeat. It resists the entropic increase that the supernal scar constantly imposes. It maintains the texture of the physical laws we rely upon. If the fire dies, the tension between what should be and what is will immediately exceed the breaking point. Silas detailed the strict time limit. The fire must burn continuously from the moment the fog rolls in, dusk, until the fog completely dissipates, dawn. This is the period when dimensions overlap most fiercely, and the ossuary is most vulnerable to the outside cold. If the fire goes out, even for a single second, the ossuary's coherence will begin to drop. The air will grow colder, but not cold in temperature. It is metaphysical cold, the cold of void space. The room corners will begin to drift. The matter of the building will begin to recall its non-material origins, and it will seek organic matter to anchor itself once again. He looked directly at me, his eyes conveying a terrible memory. It will begin to absorb what is nearest. And typically, that is what is breathing. There is no warning, no scream, only the physical recontextualization of your body into an integral part of the wall, the floor, or worse, the ash box. Remember these 3 things, Silas concluded, placing a small shovel filled with gray cinder dust next to my glass. Refuse reflection, lay the cinder dust barrier, and maintain the eternal fire. These are not options. They are the physical laws the ossuary imposes upon its unfortunate guests. Silence enveloped the room after Silas finished the rules, broken only by the steady crackle of the hearth fire, as if it were counting down the remaining seconds. Silas produced an old, nearly disintegrated parchment scroll and began detailing the horrific consequences of broken covenants, focusing especially on the fire covenant. We have recorded 2 instances where the eternal fire was extinguished since my service began here, and both prove that the penalty is not conventional death, but painful transformation into architectural matter, Silas said, utterly without sympathy. The first instance, material condensation, fire out 90 minutes, occurred in 1951. A careless attendant fell asleep and let the wood run out. The fire was completely out for about 90 minutes before it was discovered and restored. No one vanished. No bodies. Everyone woke up in an unexplainable deep chill, but all were breathing, Silas recounted. However, the next morning, when I cleared the hearth, I discovered solid, gray objects nestled among the coals. 6 fossilized human cartilage finger rings. Silas explained they were not relics of old incidents. They were created in that very moment. When the fire dies, the ossuary needs matter to compensate for the structural loss. It doesn't kill outright, but it demands a partial physical tax. The 6 rings corresponded to the middle and ring fingers of 3 night shift employees. They woke with perfectly healthy fingers, no sign of injury, but those cartilage rings had been excised cleanly from their bodies and cast into hardened material in the ash box. This confirmed a terrifying truth. The ossuary doesn't just store relics. It actively manufactures structural matter from the organic material it consumes. The second instance, mass reconfiguration, occurred more recently, in 1998, and was an act of deliberate sabotage, Silas said, his voice carrying a subtle disgust this time. A mysterious, drunken tourist scoffed at the fire covenant as superstitious nonsense. He used a bucket of water to extinguish the fire completely at 2 a.m. The fire was out for only about 15 minutes. When Silas rushed down to the hall and restored it, there was a deadly silence. The guest was missing from his room. The following morning, the guest was found cast deep into the main load-bearing wall behind the hall. He wasn't crushed, stuffed, or bricked in alive, Silas stressed. He was mass reconfigured. His entire body, from his hair to his knees, had been stretched and compressed to the point of being unrecognizable by our laws of physics. His internal organs had merged with the limestone and plaster. He was no longer a man. He was a part of the wall. The detail that made the incident unforgettable was the victim's face. Though stretched to near invisibility, his features were strangely preserved, with wide-open eyes and a gaping mouth, holding the pure, absolute horror of his final moment. He became a composite of structure and anguish, Silas concluded. It wasn't death. It was transformation into maintenance matter. He is now an integral part of the wall, forever bracing the ossuary's impossible angles. Whenever we hear faint moaning emanating from that wall on the coldest nights, that is him holding the structure upright. Silas folded the parchment, and his focus shifted to the sealed rooms upstairs. These rooms were not just vacant quarters. They were memory vaults, preserving the gruesome experiments the ossuary performed on those who breached the covenants. Many rooms have been permanently sealed with a mixture of lead and cinder dust. Each one represents a failure, a lesson in geometry and adherence, Silas said. Room 7, the bridal suite. This couple arrived in 1934, ignoring all advice from my predecessor. Specifically, they neglected the cinder dust covenant. The groom was found in the bedroom. He had successfully torn out all his fingernails with his teeth and then chewed off every knuckle joint, arranging them in a perfect chain of circles on the woolen rug, Silas recounted. He was trying to create the cinder barrier using his own biological matter as the crawling entity began its work. The bride was found in the bathroom. She did not die from self-mutilation. She was hanging upside down by her Achilles tendons. An impossibly clean cut had been made and suspended above the bathtub. Horrifically, her eyelids had been sewn open with fine copper wire to force her to stare directly into the mirror. But in the mirror, there was no reflection of the bride, Silas said. Only the faint, wavering reflection of something else standing behind her. It is believed her soul was matter replaced immediately after the crawling entity passed through. The body was just a mindless replica, forced to witness the void the ossuary had created. Room 32, the ascender. This incident involved an esoteric researcher from Miskatonic University who believed she could harness the energy of the supernal scar for higher enlightenment. She vanished at midnight, but was later found in the steaming room, Silas related. She had inflicted a clean, bloodless incision running from her jaw to her abdomen. The coroner could not explain how the wound was made without damaging any major organs. The truly terrifying element was inside the room. Her entire spinal column had been removed with uncanny precision. The spine was not on the floor. It was arranged on the ripped mattress into a grotesque architectural form, an ascending stairway. Each vertebra was carefully placed, like a miniature step, stacked upon the last, and leading directly up to the ceiling, pointing toward a blind spot in the space where she believed she could ascend. She achieved enlightenment, but the price was physical existence. She became a geometric locator, a living pointer, aimed squarely at the void we are cloaking, Silas concluded. Silas set his glass down, the clink, this time sharp and definitive. The blizzard outside had begun to intensify, and the wind shrieking through the window cracks sounded like metal being torn. He stared hard at me, his gaze no longer vacant but containing a direct threat. He reiterated that these rules were a survival obligation for both him and me this night. His final warning, delivered like a last prayer against the oncoming storm. Before the dark falls completely, you must ensure the cinder dust is laid around where you sleep. For tonight, the ossuary is hungry, and geometry waits for new matter to consolidate itself. The reality outside is thinning tonight. I can feel the pressure differential in my teeth, a dull thrum that often precedes a major structural correction. I am Silas, and though I might appear to be the proprietor of this remote establishment, I assure you I am not a servant. I am a keeper of the old covenants, rules that must be obeyed to prevent the entire structure from collapsing into the void it struggles to conceal. My eyes, ash gray and too wide, have seen things human minds refuse to process, and I recount grotesque tragedy with the same flat tone one might use to read a mathematical theorem. The ossuary is not a building. It is an architectural anomaly constructed directly upon what I call the supernal wound, a point of forgotten existence. It is an entity demanding adherence, a repository for the remnants of its victims, managed by a heretical trust long ago purged from history. This structure squats at a temporal and spatial blind spot. Any navigational equipment brought near registers nothing but white static noise. The history of its impossible genesis is documented best by the tragedy of architect Elias Thorne in 1902. Thorne led the survey team sent to locate this precise location. His entire crew vanished. Thorne was the only one recovered, found paralyzed and covered head to toe in intricate, self-inflicted geometric incisions etched into his flesh. He died in a delirium, begging the geometry to release him. The horror, however, was that those cuts were the perfect, detailed blueprints for the ossuary, including every structural flaw that would manifest decades later. The ossuary was not built using conventional materials. It was summoned from a dark geometrical concept. The maintenance of this anomaly is paid for by the Etheric Trust, EST Unknown, an organization officially declared extinct by the Inquisition in the 16th century. Because the ossuary resists material physics, our survival relies on the three core rules, the binding covenants, which prevent the outside cold from leaking in. These are not superstitions. They are the physical laws of this location. The first is the refusal of reflection. Any attempt to photograph or record the ossuary fails. The resulting images are either stark black or display scenes of a non-Euclidean space. Only one photograph survived, taken in 1972, showing a woman labeled the target, with a visible crack running across her forehead like a clumsy suture line. The second is the rampart of cinder dust. Before the end of your first night, you must draw a complete circle of cinder dust around your bed. This ash is the residual matter of historical immolation within the ossuary, acting as a physical barrier against the crawling entity, a non-defined life form that moves only through non-physical angles. The third is the heart of stone. The fire in the main hearth must burn continuously, never extinguished from the moment the fog descends, dusk, until the moment it retreats, dawn. This flame is the ossuary's pulse of reality, maintaining its structural integrity. I take a slow sip of my brandy. The ice cubes clink, sounding sharp, like metal striking metal. My face remains impassive as I continue, my voice as flat as the surface of a frozen lake. When we speak of punishment, we must discard all notions of moral retribution. The ossuary has no heart. It does not act out of judgment. It operates purely from physical necessity. If you pull at a thread anchoring reality, it must find the nearest available mass to plug that gap. And that matter is you. I tap a finger lightly on the old wooden table, material that, if you look closely, seems to have grain patterns that shift under the dim light. The eternal flame is the most critical, as it directly relates to the structure's stability. The fire is a pressure regulator. It prevents the encroaching, warped geometrical concepts from overwhelming the Euclidean physics we desperately cling to. When the fire dies, the pressure drops. Air does not rush in, the outside cold rushes in. This is a cold that paralyzes the laws of our universe, a cold we call the interstice. I have twice witnessed this momentary collapse. 2 times men have, deliberately or accidentally, violated the eternal flame covenant, and 2 times the ossuary has protected itself by recycling the transgressors. The first time the fire failed was in 1937, on a night worse than this one. It was a simple carelessness. The watchman fell asleep after his shift. When I awoke, the air in the main hall was not merely cold, it was dense. All sound was swallowed. It was only 90 minutes. I relit the fire using specially consecrated tinder, but the damage was done. The search for the watchman failed. No struggle, no blood, no broken windows. Only one thing. The hearth, now roaring back to life, retained evidence of the exchange. We found them in the ashpan, I say, shrugging as if discussing a paid invoice. 6 solid gray objects of uniform size, resting among the remnants of ash and charcoal. They were not stone or metal, but organic matter transformed under non-physical heat and pressure. They were 6 fossilized human cartilage finger rings, geometrically perfect, each displaying a distinct golden ratio, as if molded in a mathematical die. We identified them as belonging to the watchman. Cartilage, the most pliable, flexible material in the human body, had been extracted, compressed, and rendered into an indestructible form of matter. Why 6? Why only the finger joints? Perhaps that was the optimal durability material the ossuary needed to shore up a minor structural fault. Or perhaps that was simply the quantity of matter the ossuary deemed sufficient to compensate for 90 minutes of engineering error. The ossuary does not need you dead, I emphasize. It needs your matter. The 1937 incident proved the structure could perform microsurgery, selecting the specific components it required and reconstituting them into perpetual building material. The second incident, more recent, only a few decades ago, is what truly sets the standard for those who challenge the laws here. That guest was a theoretical researcher of physical singularities. He arrived with the arrogance of science, believing the covenants were psychological metaphors. I recount, my gray eyes fixed upon my listener. He grew drunk around midnight, after ridiculing my superstitious management system. He then took a bucket of ice water and extinguished the flame. The moment the fire died, I describe, a terrible shriek echoed through the ossuary, not a shriek of steam, but the shriek of reality shifting frequency. It was a moment when our physics was paused. I whisper. The entire structure vibrated, and the walls seemed to inhale. I rushed forward and spent nearly 20 minutes fighting the current of cold, trying to push me away before I could manage to relight the fire. The researcher was found the next morning, but he was not on the floor, nor was he turned to cartilage. He had become a part of the architecture. He was cast deep into the main load-bearing wall behind the hall. I explained, pointing to the thick stone. This wall, it is not built of sandstone. It is built of pressure. The image I described transcends the threshold of mere gore. The researcher had been simultaneously stretched and compressed. His body was elongated, his bones broken and rearranged along unnatural straight lines, and then forcefully pressed into the mortar and stone. Imagine being crushed into a thin sheet, yet retaining volume. This is impossible in 3 dimensions, but the ossuary accomplished it using at least 5. He was flat, inextricably bonded with the stone, yet if you touched the wall, you would feel his depth within it. His skin was pressed smooth, adhered to the rock. His hair became part of the plaster. Limbs were drawn out and thinned like wire filaments, burrowing deep into the structural mass, becoming organic rebar. But the most terrifying aspect was the face. Though compressed beyond physical recognition, the researcher's expression was preserved. Eyes wide, mouth agape. Holding the terror of the moment, he realized the laws of the universe had been suspended. He is not a corpse, I state chillingly. He became a functional component of structure and anguish. He is still there, still perceiving the gravitational pull dragging the entirety of the ossuary into the interstice, and his very deformed physical presence is now supporting the impossible angles of the building. He is a living pillar, a construction material that maintains our eternity. I conclude this section with a sharp reminder. When you break the covenant, the ossuary does not kill you. It assimilates you. It turns you into the matter it requires to persist. And if you retain consciousness when that happens, the punishment is eternal. That is the fate of those who disrespect the geometry of this place. Finally, I describe the sealed rooms, testaments to the ghastly experiments the ossuary has performed and archived. Room 7, the bridal suite. The groom was found having voluntarily pulled out his fingernails and chewed off all his finger joints after ignoring the cinder covenant. The bride was found in the bathroom, suspended by her Achilles tendons, her eyelids stitched open with fine copper wire to force her to stare straight into the mirror, which held no reflection of her at all. They believed the other had been substituted by the matter. Room 32, the ascender, where a researcher of esoteric traditions disappeared. She was found in the sauna, having performed a clean incision from jaw to abdomen. Her entire spine had been removed with impossible precision and arranged on the ripped mattress into a step descent, each vertebra carefully positioned like a stair leading directly to the ceiling, towards a spatial blind spot above. I set down the brandy glass, staring at my guest as the blizzard outside begins to sound like metal being scraped. I reiterate that these laws are the obligation of survival for tonight. My final warning, delivered like a bleak prayer. Before the shadows deepen, you must ensure the cinder dust is laid down. Because tonight, the ossuary is hungry. Silas never needed to raise his voice to command the space. Although he served the guests, the manner in which he moved, slowly, purposefully, his ashes-gray eyes seeming to hold a cooled horror, set him on a plane separate from mortal men. The reality outside is thinning, he stated, not as a warning, but as a confirmation of the present weather condition. Tonight, the boundary will retract. The ossuary was not a building. It was a bruise, an architectural anomaly constructed directly upon the conceptual blind spot of existence. Silas called it the wound in the ether, a place where the very notions of space and time began to buckle and crack. I am not a hospitality manager, Silas continued, meticulously polishing an already spotless glass. I am the keeper. I maintain the old covenants. These rules are not superstitions. They are physical theorems written to keep this structure from collapsing entirely into the void it strains to conceal. His tone was flat, an icy detachment that made the gruesome statements all the more terrifying. He recounted ghastly tragedies as though reading outdated mathematical proofs, precise, necessary, and entirely undeniable. The ossuary was an entity demanding adherence, a repository for the material residue of things scientists, theologians, and dreamers had been absorbed by. Everything here was heavy and old, managed by a heretical trust, erased from all human historical records, or at least from the version of history we acknowledge as true. Upkeep is costly, Silas concluded, but the price of collapse is vastly higher. We are holding a door shut. Tonight, you must obey what I say, not for your comfort, but for the integrity of the universe. The ossuary exists in a blind spot. No map or navigation system can register it. Any electronic device attempting to pinpoint its location merely records a wash of white noise static, a conceptual rejection. Silas revealed the structure's impossible genesis, starting with the architect Elias Thorne's tragedy of 1902. Thorne had led an expedition searching for the wound in the ether to build a research station. They vanished for 3 weeks. They found Thorne lying in a dried wheat field, Silas recounted. He was alive, but paralyzed, and his body was covered in incisions. These incisions were not random wounds. They were etched across Thorne's flesh, from scalp to heel, forming complex, non-Euclidean geometric diagrams that even modern mathematicians could not fully rationalize. Thorne died in a screaming delirium, his final breath a horrified plea. Geometry, release me. The most terrifying discovery came when structural engineers examined Thorne's body closely. The incisions were the perfectly detailed blueprints of the ossuary. They included every cross-section, every angle, and, horribly, every structural failure that would appear in the future. The ossuary was not built with mortar and steel, Silas explained, his gaze sweeping over the impossibly proportioned ceiling beams. It was summoned. It is the physical manifestation of a dark geometric concept, forced into this three-dimensional space through the pain and unwanted understanding of Elias Thorne. The funds for the structure's maintenance do not come from conventional budgets. They are untraceable transfers, originating from an entity called Etheric Trust, EST unknown, an organization supposedly purged by inquisitions in the 16th century for celestial worship. They no longer exist in a conventional sense, Silas murmured, but the payments are always timely. Now, we come to the crucial part. The 3 mandatory covenants, Silas said, placing a neatly folded napkin beside the guest's water glass. If you break one, the ossuary does not punish you, it merely adjusts. And that adjustment is always total annihilation. 1. The refusal of reflection. No cameras, no phones. Make no attempt to record anything you see, Silas commanded. Every attempt to photograph the ossuary fails. The image either turns black, like a cosmic data error, or shows an image of an adjacent space, a similar corridor, but constructed entirely from bone marrow and fossilized cartilage. Silas pointed to a single, small, antique photo tucked away in a corner. Only one image survived, from 1972, before the covenant was tightened. It showed a woman referred to as the target. She was smiling, but a dark, physical fissure ran across her head, like a crude seam. Reality does not wish to be recorded. When you attempt to copy it, it tears. 2. The cinder dust. Before the first night is through, you must sprinkle a complete circle of cinder dust around your bed, Silas stressed. He placed a coarse cloth bag on the table. This ash is the residue of incinerated matter from the ossuary's history, flesh, timber, and sometimes other things we prefer not to define. It forms a conceptual and physical barrier against the entity that crawls. The entity that crawls is not an organic monster. It is a structural interruption, a creature that moves in non-physical angles indiscernible to the human eye. It craves heat and organic matter. It cannot pass through the material barrier of which it was once a part. If you neglect the dust, you will awaken in a state of dissolution, and you will become the dust for the next guest. 3. The heart of stone. This is the most critical, Silas affirmed, staring at the leaping flames in the massive, gray stone main hearth. This fire must burn continuously, never going out from the moment the fog rolls in, dusk, until the fog retreats, dawn. The hearth fire is not merely for warmth. It is the ossuary's reality heartbeat. It is the thermal energy required to maintain our physicality. When the fire dies, the pressure from the outer cold floods in. Everything begins to warp, and the things we have sealed away attempt to escape. Punishment in the ossuary is always geometric and constructive. When covenants are broken, the structure demands equilibrium through material replacement. Silas recounted 2 times the hearth fire was extinguished. Case 1, Structural Demand, 1947. A guest, an archaeologist, doubted the esoteric nature of it all. He allowed the fire to die for 90 minutes one early morning. The ossuary did not immediately collapse, but it reacted. The next morning, solid, gray, frigid objects were found in the ash bin. They were 6 calcified human phalanx rings. Our guest was alive, but in agonizing pain. While the fire was out, the ossuary manufactured material from the things it had previously absorbed, drawing the cartilage from that man's fingers to supplement the structure, Silas explained. He never regained the use of his hands, but he gained respect. Case 2. The horrific integration, 1998. This was the most gruesome incident. A drunken guest deliberately mocked the mandatory covenants, dumping a bucket of ice water onto the hearth. He caused a structural lapse lasting nearly 3 hours, Silas said, a rare coldness entering his voice. The man was found the following morning, not dead, but molded deep into the main load-bearing wall behind the lobby. His body was stretched and compressed to an unrecognizable degree by normal physics. Every proportion of bone, tissue, and skin was deformed to perfectly match the pressure points of the stone he was pressed into. He became a part of the mortar. His face, stretched and distorted but recognizable, was fixed in eternal horror. Silas explained. He became part of the structure and the pain, forever supporting the impossible angles of the ossuary. When you press your ear against that wall, you can hear a faint sound, like bones cracking, every time the structure breathes. These anecdotes are the entry-level lessons, Silas said, leaning back slightly in the worn leather armchair. But then there are the sealed rooms, the places where the experiments exceeded physical boundaries, where the ossuary truly revealed its nature. He gestured toward the upper floor, where a corridor was barred by heavy steel mesh. These are the memory vaults, the storage for total failure. Guests come seeking the unknown. They find it, and the ossuary keeps the remains. ##### Room 7, the bridal suite. Room 7 was once a luxurious honeymoon suite, occupied by a young couple in the early 70s. They disregarded the cinder dust, viewing it as a macabre joke. They merely fell asleep, Silas said. But when they awoke, they were no longer themselves. The husband, David, was found in the sitting area, sitting on the floor, his hands covered in blood. He had surgically removed all of his fingernails, not with brute force, but with terrifying accuracy, almost like a medical procedure. Next, he bit off the distal joints of all his fingers, the bones plucked cleanly from the skin without tearing, Silas detailed. He explained, between sobs, that he had heard the entity that crawls, a low, sticky, dragging moan beneath the floorboards. It told him his organic material was a geometric obscenity, and only by removing the redundant parts could he make himself accurate. The wife, Sarah, was found in the bathroom. She had not physically harmed herself in the conventional way. She was suspended by her Achilles tendons, which had been surgically exposed and tied with coarse rope. But that was not the worst, Silas continued. Her eyelids had been tightly sewn shut with fine copper wire, a meticulously horrifying piece of craftsmanship, forcing her to stare directly into the bathroom mirror. Sarah was found alive but catatonic. And the horror was this. She was looking into the mirror, but there was no reflection of her. She believed the person next to her had been replaced by the substance. And when she looked at her reflection, or rather, the absence of it, she realized she, too, had been replaced. She was a hollow replica, only retaining biological function. The ossuary had taken the soul, or whatever accounted for herself, and replaced it with supporting structural material. Room 7 was sealed. When workers attempted to dismantle the furniture, the floor began to sweat a viscous black fluid that smelled of ozone and dried blood. #### Room 32, the Ascender. Room 32 holds the tale of an esoteric researcher, Dr. Ilara Vance. She came to the ossuary believing that non-Euclidean architecture was the key to ascending from material constraints. She stayed for 7 months, obeying all covenants, until she decided she had to provide a piece of herself for the ascension she sought, Silas related. Dr. Vance was found in her sealed sitting room. She had sliced herself open in a clean, flawless cut from jaw to abdomen. Her hand held a dull scalpel, suggesting the act had been slow, excruciating, and entirely self-willed. But there was no blood spatter. Everything was horrifically contained, Silas said, closing his eyes as if recalling an image too vivid. Vance's entire spinal column had been removed with unimaginable precision. There was no damage to vital organs. It was as if a non-human hand had performed the surgery. Vance was still alive when found, lying on the floor, smiling with vacant eyes. The terrifying part was how she arranged the bones, Silas said, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a hiss. All 33 vertebrae were carefully placed upon her torn mattress, forming the ascending staircase. Each vertebra was set like a small step, geometrically perfect, leading straight to the ceiling, toward a conceptual blind spot in the air. It was not a decorative model. It was a tool, a physical diagram. She sacrificed her physical foundation to create a pathway to understanding, Silas concluded. We found a single note written in blood and bile. It contained only one word: connect. Dr. Vance died hours later, but the horrific smile remained. Room 32 is sealed, and it is rumored that if you pass by at night, you can hear the faint sound of bones rubbing together, as if the staircase is attempting to climb itself. Silas set the glass of spirits down, the small sound echoing in the abrupt silence. Outside, the blizzard had intensified, but the sound of the wind was no longer just wind. It sounded like scraping metal, the deep, guttural groan of a massive object shifting. Silas stared at the guest with his ashes-gray eyes, the detachment gone. There was palpable urgency in his voice. Tonight, the pressure is at its maximum. You have heard of the entity that crawls, and you have heard of the outer cold. This rule is your survival obligation. He gestured to the bag of dust on the table. Before the darkness fully descends, before the doors of your mind begin opening to concepts it cannot process, you must ensure that the cinder dust is laid. It is not merely a circle. It must be a thick, unbroken barricade. He handed the room key to the guest, cold and heavy. Go immediately. Do not waste a minute in contemplation. For tonight, the ossuary is not merely a building. It is hungry, and it wants something whole to absorb.